Hi, everyone. For my final presentation, I chose to focus on the disability justice movement. I was particularly drawn to this movement because, as I mentioned, I have worked in disability for the past 6 years, and through my work directly from the people that I've supported, I've learned so much about the inequities that people with disabilities face. Something that really stood out to me while researching this movement is the difference between disability rights and disability justice. This also speaks to our shift away from things like disability awareness, autism awareness toward autism acceptance. Um, while the disability rights has created extremely important protections for people with disabilities. Disability justice asks us to look a little bit deeper at the systems that continue to create inequity for disabled people, and specifically disabled people who hold multiple marginalized identities. So yeah, looking just at history and why there is a need for the disability justice movement. Before talking about the disability justice specifically, I think it's important that we understand the history that led us to it. Historically, disability was largely viewed through a medical lens, meaning that disability was seen as something inherently wrong with a person that needed to be treated, cured, hidden, and controlled. The images here show some of the consequences of that thinking. On the left is Ruth Davis, who was exhibited in slideshows as the Penguin Girl. Um, the other images show conditions within institutions like Pennhurst and Willowbrook, where disabled people were segregated from their communities and often subjected to horrific living conditions, such as being shackled, restrained, and um, placed in overcrowded, quite literally cages. Um, so disability activism can grew out of a history where disabled people were denied not only access to um, really the community, but autonomy and basic human dignity. So, a timeline of disability policy in the US. Beginning in the 70s, disability activists increasingly challenged these conditions. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973 was one of the first major federal civil rights protections for people with disabilities. This was followed by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which expanded protections against disability discrimination. Then in 1999, Olmsted versus LC challenged unnecessary institutionalization and affirmed the right of disabled people to receive services within integrated community settings. These were major accomplishments, but by the early 2000s, disabled activists were also asking whether just simply access to services was enough. And this is where we began to see the disability justice movement emerge. So, the ADA and Olmsted are really good examples of both the progress that has been made, and also why just disability justice is still needed. As an example, on the left, the ADA made disability discrimination illegal and required accommodations and accessibility in many areas of public life. However, it did not necessarily address the structural inequities that are already embedded within the institutions. Similarly, Olmsted challenged unnecessary institutionalization and recognized that the right to receive services in integrated community settings. But having the right does not automatically mean adequate housing, caregivers, transportation, funding, and other community supports um, automatically exist. I think this distinction is really important. Being legally allowed into a system doesn't mean that a system is equitable. Disability justice asks us to examine and transform the system itself. So who built the disability justice movement? This framework was emerged around 2005 through the work of disability activists, including Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacy Milburn, and Leroy Moore. What distinguished this movement was whose experiences were being centered. Many of its founders were queer and disabled people of color whose experiences were not fully represented within the mainstream disability rights movement. Leroy Moore described this by saying that disability justice was born out of communities of color that had been excluded from the disability rights movement. So from its beginning, disability justice understood ableism as something that could not be separated from racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or economic inequality. So the disability movement, disability justice movement, I'm sorry, is founded off of 10 principles. I won't go through all 10 individually, but I think together they show how different this framework is from other disability movements simply by focusing on accommodations. So some of the principles that stood out to me the most were leadership of those most impacted, recognizing wholeness, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. There is also an anti-capitalist component that challenges the idea by that someone's value should be determined by their ability to work or be productive. I see this a lot in my work, trying to help folks I support trying to get jobs. So it's so important. And ultimately, these principles shift the focus away from asking disabled people to become more independent or fit into existing systems and toward asking how communities can become more accessible, interdependent, and equitable. So yeah, intersectionality really is the foundation of disability justice. Patty Byrne explains that our experiences of ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, religion, nationality, and other identities cannot simply be separated from one another, which we've learned so much about in this course. For example, the experience of a wealthy white disabled person may be very, very different from the experience of a disabled Black woman living in poverty, even if they have the same disability. This is why disability justice specifically centers people whose experiences exist at multiple intersections of oppression. It recognizes that addressing ableism without also addressing racism, poverty, sexism, transphobia, and other structural inequities will inevitably leave some disabled people behind. So, what does disability justice actually look like in practice? One piece is collective access. Rather than requiring someone to individually request an accommodation every time they need one, we can start asking communities what access they need from the beginning and treat accessibility like a shared responsibility. Another one is community care, including mutual aid and investment in home and community-based supports rather than relying on these institutions that have over and over failed us. And finally, there is collective power. Disability justice believes disabled people should be leading the decisions that directly affect their lives, and that disability activism should work alongside other social movements to create structural change. This is really the difference between simply providing access and working toward collective liberation. So, how can we implement this in our work as social workers? As social workers, we often help people navigate systems, but just disability justice asks us to also question whether those systems themselves are equitable. This that means challenging ableism within our own agencies, advocating for accessible services and resources, and building access into services from the beginning rather than waiting for someone to request an accommodation. It also means advocating, as I previously said, for community-based care rather than um, relying on institutionalization, and most importantly, working in solidarity with disabled people rather than assuming we know what is best for them. For me, that is probably my biggest takeaway from this movement. Our role shouldn't only be helping disabled people function within existing systems. We should also be listening to people with disabilities and how these systems need to change and using our position as social workers to help make these changes possible. And these are my references. Thank you so much.